Hi good people, Titus here for the final part of our Asteroids mini-series, and to round it off, we're going to be creating a save and load system to capture our players' highest scores. Let's not waste any time and jump right into it. Alright, so we're going to come into our blueprints folder, we're going to create a new blueprint class, expand out the all classes towards the bottom and just search for save, and then we're going to use the save game class. So we'll click on that, hit select, and then I'm going to title mine BP_ save game. What this blueprint's going to allow us to do is basically pop in the variables that we want to store, and then we can call the save and load functions to basically tell it to write to a file on our computer. But I'll kind of show you what I mean by that. So we got the blueprint open. Let's create a couple variables. For this prototype, we're really just going to be storing the player's high score, and we created the initials screen on the previous video, so we'll be storing that as well. So two variables. We'll do the first one as the initials, and that was a string. And then on the right-hand inspector panel with the details, we're going to hit this little option here, and we're actually going to make it an array, because we're going to have multiple points of initials and scores basically. Then we'll add a second variable. This one's going to be a score, and I made this a float type, so we're going to switch the data type to be float to match, and then that's pretty much it for the variables. We can use two custom events, so we'll add a custom event. First one we'll save or call save initials, and then the second one we'll call save score. And then we can just simply hold control and drag out our initials, and then hold control and drag out our score. And then if you pull off that, we can come into an array function called add. And then we'll do the same thing for our score. And it's just an array utility, and just hit add here. And then we're basically going to pass in a string value from our event for both the initials and the score. To be able to do that, if you select your custom event on the right-hand inspector, there's a input section. Just hit the little plus sign. And for this one, I'm going to call it add text. And this, of course, is a string. And then I can just pass this in here and hook up my execution pins like so. And then for my score, I'll hit the plus sign and call it maybe add points. And then this one will be of type float, and then I can just pass in that value and hook up my execution pins, and this completes the entirety of the blueprint for the save game class. It's pretty simple. So we'll be calling this from a few different places, mainly from the game manager, but we'll also have to call it from our initials widget that we created in the previous video, because that's where the player enters their initials. That's the only logical place to be able to do that from. So let's actually go into our game manager. And then we were using this little temporary code to demonstrate that the initial screen was working. We can actually delete that now. We no longer need it. And then there's some references in some of the other blueprints that we'll have to clean up later. So let's create 3 custom events. We'll create a custom event to load the game, and then we'll create another one to save the game, and then we'll create a final one, and this one we can call maybe dump data or restore data or something like that. I know it's going to be similar to the load game, but it's actually pretty different. I'll kind of explain it here in a second. So I think starting off, let's define the save game first. So we basically, let's actually figure out where we want to call this first. So we have some respawn logic here. We say if the player's lives is less than or equal to 0, we call into the game over widget. So we can actually call the save game logic here as well. And then for the load game, we'll probably want to do that on the begin play. So we can actually pull off the end here and just call load game. And what this is going to do is we're going to, assuming we've saved the data to a file, when we load the game back up, we want to pull in those variables, these variables here, back into our game manager so it can display it to the player on the actual screen there. Okay, so with that set up, let's pull off the save game. The function that makes this all work is called create save game object, this one right here. And then the save game class, that's going to be the one that we created, which is BP_save game. We can right click and promote this to a variable so we can use it later. I'm going to just call this my save game reference. After I've run this logic, I want to call the restore data. So I'm going to pull off here and call that custom event there. And then after that, I'm going to call the save score, but I can only access that from our actual object here. So this thing right here. So let's pull off this pin and call save score. Because this logic's basically going to run when the player has finished their last life. So we need to pass in the variable that's storing our current score, which is just called score. So we can basically just grab this variable and drag it in here, and that'll work for our purposes here. And then once we've done that, we can call the save game to slot, and this is the function that actually writes the data to a file on your PC. The slot name is going to be the name of the file that gets written. So I'm just going to call this one high scores. And then for the save game object that's going to be handling this, this is of course our BP_save game. So I can just pass this over here like so. And that's pretty much going to be it for the save game custom event. The restore data or data dump, whatever you want to call it, we're going to need some variables to make this work. And these are going to have to be arrays, because we basically need a way to pass the information from the game manager to that, to a few different places actually, to the save game state, as well as some of our widgets, if we need to. So for the variables, let's add a new one. We'll call this SG for save game. We'll call it initials. And we're going to set that to a string. Now this also needs to be an array. So we can come over to our inspector, hit this little drop down here and set that to an array. Once you have that set, add a new variable, and we're going to call this one SG score. And the data type for this one, of course, has to match float. All right, with that set, we can pull off our initials array. So we'll hold control, drag it in. Then we can pull into a for each loop. So this will basically loop or iterate through for every item inside our array. And then for the loop body, we want to call the custom event we created in this save game state called save initials. So let's just drag in our save game reference that we made just a little while ago. And then we can pull off that into save initials. And then loop body will execute here, and then we can pass the array element into here. That's basically just dumping the data from the game manager into our blueprint that handles, writing the information to the file on the computer. So this will loop through all the elements in this array, and then once it's completed, we need to create another loop, but this time we need to loop through all the elements in the score array. Now this doesn't make a lot of sense starting off because the array is going to be empty, but we're doing this logic in the event that the game has been played a few times and we have data in that file already that we need to basically pass back and forth. So from the loop body, we can basically pull into the save score method. So we'll need the game reference again. And if we pull off that, we have that custom event we made called save score. And then our loop body can hook up here, and then we can pass the array element into the save score, and that'll dump that data back in to our save game blueprint. Once we've looped through all the arrays and we've dumped all the data, we can then come into a save game to slot again, just to make sure we write it to file. So we'll need a reference to our save game object again, and then just like above, save game to slot. And then the slot name, I'm going to match it to be the same one up here. So I called it high scores. Just like that. And this, of course, you could make dynamic, and you can have the player actually enter in a name. So they can basically save the file and title it whatever they want. But it kind of demonstrates the, I guess, the main point of it. All right, so that handles saving the game, and that handles dumping the data between the game manager and the save game blueprint. But we need to handle the logic for loading the game. So when we pull off the load game, there's a function called load game from slot. Slot name has to match whatever you've been using. In my case, it is high scores. Off that return value, I can come into a cast, and I'm going to cast to my save game blueprint. And then I can pull off that, and I can access those two arrays that we created in this blueprint, which is initials and score. So I pull off and I say get score, and then I can pull off and get initials. And then we can basically fill our game manager's array, SG initials, which save game initials, and SG score, or save game score. I'm just going to hold Alt, click and drag this in, and that gives me two setters, and I can just dump the data back into these arrays just in case I need it. So now we have load game logic, we have save game logic, and we have some logic to dump data between a couple different blueprints. So pretty straightforward for there. Now, this is pretty much the bulk of the code. We are going to have to make some adjustments to some other blueprints. The first one we have to go into from the previous video was our initials widget. So we'll come to our widgets folder. We created a WBP initials. And then if I go to the graph here, we deleted a variable that we're no longer using. So this is erroring out. And we're also making a reference to the game manager. We're no longer going to be using the game manager for the save game state. Instead, we can pull off into the same thing we did before, called load game from slot. And we're instead just going to read that data directly from the file. You could pass it between the game manager if you wanted, and just store it that way. The way I've set it up, it basically gives you the option to do either or you can just pull it directly from the file. It's kind of up to you. The file was called high scores. If I pull off this pin, I can then cast to the BP_save game object that we created. And then if I needed to, I don't think I do. Actually, no, I think I do. We can create a reference to the game save. And then I can delete my game manager reference because I don't think I use that anywhere else. And then after this do once loop, we can actually pull in our game save reference, pull into this into a save initials, and then we're going to be passing the initials that we're getting from this widget, because this is the widget that basically has the player enter their initials. So after they do that, we'll just go ahead and pass that straight into the game save blueprint, and then store those initials. And then just like before, we want to write this to a file on the computer. So we're going to call that save game to slot, but that's only going to work as a reference. So I can just grab this game reference here, duplicate it, drag in, and then call the save game to slot. And I'm going to use the same slot name, high scores. Hopefully this is making sense. Okay, so that pretty much takes care of the logic cleanup that we needed from the previous video, just because we're basically swapping from using the game manager to drive that logic to using this save game blueprint, just to kind of demonstrate this, this methodology. So now we can finally come into the high score widget. So this is where we currently looks like we're displaying 3 high scores. So maybe it might be a little bit fun to display only the highest scores. So let's come into our graph, and we have a lot of logic here. Let's not use the game manager anymore. And we're gonna have to probably clean up and create some custom functions and events. So let's get rid of all this. And in the pre-construct, we will load the data from that file. So load game from slot. Slot name was high scores. And then from that, we can cast to our save game blueprint. And then from that, we can steal a reference. So save game reference. And then I can delete my game manager because I don't think I need it. And then we're going to probably drive this with maybe 2 functions I think we can get away with. So let's create a first function, maybe we'll call it set score. And then the second function we can call maybe sort array, because we need to figure out the highest scores in our current array. Let's go back to our event graph here. So after the pre-construction, we go into construction. We can call the set score function, and then we can pass in this 8-second delay and then open the new level, and that's the entirety of the code on our main event graph. But if we actually come over to our set score, we're going to need some variables to actually drive this logic. So let's go ahead and create a new variable. First one, let's create a count variable. Set it to an integer. We're going to be using this to loop through our arrays. And then the next one we'll maybe call a sorted, we'll call it sorted score. This will be a float, and I'm actually going to set this to be an array. So just like I did in the game manager, I'm just basically creating another array so I can dump contents from one array into another. And we'll call this sorted initials. And this will be a string. And then the last thing I might need is, just in case, an index. And I'm going to set that to be an integer and a single value. So I can get away with just these 4 variables basically. So count, sorted score, sorted initials, and index. And of course we have our older variables that we created from the previous videos, but we're not worried about those in this one. So I think starting off, we can get our blueprint that contains our save game logic. We can then get a reference to our score array. From that score array, we can pull off and tell it to get the length. And by length, that basically just means how many items are in this array. And then I can hold Alt and drag out the, the count. And then I can pass in the length into count. And this count variable is basically going to be the number of items inside my array. And the reason I'm doing this in a separate variable is because we're going to be modifying the contents of this array as we iterate through it. So we need a value that's not going to change as we start removing items from it, basically. I can then pull off this count index, or this count number, and then say if this number is greater than 0, then I can pull into a while control loop. And then as long as this number is greater than 0, I can call that second function we made called sort array. When it is equal to 0 or less than 0, then I'm going to call a sequence. But before we go into the sequence, let's work on the actual sort function here. So we'll go into the sort array here. And then what we're going to do is kind of similar. We'll get a reference to our save game blueprint. This one makes more sense if we get a reference to our score array. So we're basically going to say, all right, get the array of all the items. That is the score. And Unreal has a function that does this for you. It's called max. In this case, max a float array, but if you're doing integers, it'll have max of integers and whatnot. So basically it's just going to say, go through this array and find the highest score. And from that, it's going to give us two pieces of information. It's going to give us the value of that high score, and it's going to give us the position in the array where that resides. So right off the bat, I'm going to hold Alt, drag in my index, and I'm going to capture that position in my index variable. The reason I need to capture that as a variable is because, again, we're going to be removing items from this array, so the index is going to change. So we need a static reference to it, basically. And then I can say, I can drag, hold Control, and drag my sorted score array, pull off that into the add function, and then I can just pass that maximum value inside my sorted array. It'll come in, because this is an empty array of 0 elements, so it'll pass this under element 0, which is the first item in the array. It'll contain the maximum value. I then need to get the string or the initials variable to that score. So the way we can do that is I can just hold Control, drag the sorted initials, pull into an add, and because we have the index, I know where that position is, because it's going to be in the same index position as the score, right? Because we capture them at the same time, or relatively close at the same time anyways. So all we do is just get our save game reference, drag that into the initials, so get initials. And then from that, we can do the get a copy or get a reference, doesn't matter. I'll do reference for this one. And then I'm going to grab index and pop that in here. That'll tell Unreal, like, go ahead and pull this array and find the initials that are at this index position. And then once I have those initials, I'm going to plug it into this sorted array under element 0, or the first item in the array. Now, once I've done that, I want to empty this array. So I can just grab a copy here. Let's duplicate this, and let's duplicate this. So just real quick, position these maybe like this. Okay. So these are the sorted arrays that live inside this widget high score. These are the score and initials array that live inside our save game blueprint, just so that's clear. So I'm going to pull off the ones from the save game blueprint. I'm going to call a function called remove index for both of these. I can then pass in this index value to both these values here, and then hook up the execution pins like so. I then want to grab, hold control, drag out count, and then I want to decrement the count value, because if you remember, we are looping through this sort array based on the fact that count is greater than 0. So say there's 2 items in this array, count's going to equal 2, which is greater than 0, so then it's going to call this function here. We then find the maximum value in the array of what we perceive as 2 items. We then add that to the sorted index array, and then we'll use the same position as the score to find the corresponding initials and add that to our sorted initials array. We are then going to remove the score and the initials array. So there was 2 items, now there's only 1. And then we're going to decrement the count, which is going to set it from 2 to 1. And then we're going to loop through this again, basically, until count is 0. And we basically sorted the array. So basically all we're doing is we're finding just the maximum value of the array. Once we find that value, we dump it to an empty array, and then we remove the value from the original array until we have no more items left. So just a simple, easy way to kind of, I guess, sort based on the highest score. So now that we've done that, we can basically go into the original code, which is once this loop completes, we're going to execute a sequence of 3 items. The reason we're doing 3 is because our high score has 3 high scores. So this will be obviously depending on, you know, how many high scores you want to actually show, I guess. Code's a little bit messy, but basically what we're going to do is we'll hold control, we'll drag out our sorted score, drag out our sorted initials, and we can actually borrow our count. Our count variable at this point is going to be 0, so we can actually reuse this. And then we can pull off into our arrays, and we'll just do get a copy. You can do reference or copy, doesn't matter. And then we can use the count variable, which is 0, to get the position of the array. So we'll start at 0, and at the end of this, we'll, instead of decrementing, we'll increment the count variable, just to go through all the different elements, basically. And then on the first sequence, we're basically going to be setting text. So if we expand out our variables, we have 3 sets of initials and 3 sets of scores. So we'll do initials first. I can just hold control. I'm going to drag this out here. And then I'll drag this one over here. And drag this one down here. And line those up. And same thing over here. I'll just drag score. Score 1. And score 2. I can just highlight these, Shift A, line them up. And then off the first one, it's the same function, it's just the set text. So I just drag off these pins here. Set text, there we go. Don't know if it would have been quicker just to copy that. All right, anyways, so once we have this, the green is the score, purple is the initials. So initials are in the front. So we just hook up the purple, it'll automatically make the conversion for us. Like so. And then green will go to the back. Makes the conversion for us, which is nice. And then we just need need to hook up our execution pins. And the first option we'll do is score and initial 0. Second one we'll do initials 1 and score 1. And third and final, initials 2 and score 2. Maybe add some reroute nodes to kind of maybe organize this a little better. It's going to be still a little messy. And maybe we'll just move these around. And maybe that is somewhat more readable. Can't tell. Anywho. Once we go through each channel, remember we need to increment the counter because we're cycling the other way this time. So we can pull off this instead of a decrement, we'll just do an increment. And this logic's actually going to be hooked up to each section here. Like so. So just going over the set score method. Hopefully I did this right. It's going to go through, it's going to get a reference to our game save state. It's going to pull the score variable, this one right here. Then going to get the length of that, so how many items are in there, set that equal to the count. We'll loop through and sort the array. The array is basically just dumping the array elements based on the highest value into our new arrays, and then we're removing those items from the corresponding array and decrementing our counter. Once we're out of this loop, we'll go into a sequence, executing 1, 2, and 3. Sequence basically sets the text elements that we have on our designer. This would be element 1, element 2, element 3. Based on the values of the sorted score and sorted initials, which are ordered based on highest to lowest. And then we're using our count variable, which is currently setting at 0. So it'll go through and get the first element, increment it to 1, and then it'll do the second element, which is because it incremented to 1, and then it'll go to 2, and then it'll go through a third time and get just the third highest value and the corresponding initials for that. So hopefully if I did all that right, we should be able to play our prototype. And we'll do a few different things here. So let's get our first score, 550. Now traditionally when we set, or I guess 950 because that UFO just blew itself up. So we'll call this my initials as 1. Now the next time we play through, traditionally the second one would go here. I'll try to get a higher score just so we can make sure that this is actually working. So I gotta beat 950. Alright, I think that's probably good. I just need a rock to hit me. There we go. Oh. Alright, there we go. So 2750, we'll set this to the initials of 2. And if it's working right, it should put it at the top of our score. You can see the top score is 2750, second score is 1, and then for the third and final test, I'll actually exit out the game. And then if we come into the file, you'll see that there's a save games folder now. And we have that high scores file that I threw into that slot name. So this is whatever you want to name it, of course. So because we did that, and because we set up the load method, it should be able to pull all that information back into the game manager, which can then pass it to the widgets. And I will now get the lowest score. And it should put me at the bottom of the scoreboard. Probably set the wait to be too long, and we'll call this number 3. And you can see it's working. So high scores at the top, second highest score is there, and there's the third highest score. And then if we play again and get a, we beat one of those top 3 scores, it should replace one of the elements in the array. All the scores will exist because we never resized the array, so that is something to consider. But maybe you want that data for whatever reason. But you can, of course, if you want to get rid of it. Under the load function, you could probably just resize the array to be 3 or whatever you want. So now I'm at 4,000, and if I die, I'm gonna put in my high score, and it should replace the one on top, and it should bump all the other ones down. And you can see that's working good. All right, everyone, I hope you enjoyed the series and learned a few things that you can take into your own projects. If you did, please consider leaving a like and a sub to help grow the channel. But as always, thanks for watching, and see you on the next one.